Today we're absolutely thrilled and delighted to welcome Vince Warren, who's a leading expert on racial justice, criminal justice, and discriminatory policing. As the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, he leads their groundbreaking work that challenges things like racial, gender, and LGBT injustice. Under Vince Warren's leadership, CCR successfully challenged the NYPD's stop, question, and frisk policy, ended long-term solitary confinement in California's Pelican Bay prison, and ended torture in Abu Ghraib prison. For his truly amazing work, Vince Warren has received many, many awards. If I listed them all, we'd be here all day and all night, but just a few recent ones. He is a recipient of the New York State Bar Association's Committee on Civil Rights Haywood Burns Memorial Award, the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers Justice Award, and the CUNY Law School Distinguished Public Service Award. We're so deeply grateful that he's here with us today to speak about visionary lawyering and activism, some topics that he knows a thing or two about. So please join me today in welcoming Vince Warren.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm Vince Warren, and I'm going to tell you a few things about me so that you know who you're listening to, and then I'll tell you a few things about my organization, and then we'll get started. So there are a couple of things you need to know about me. Number one, I started my career after law school as a public defender. I was at Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn, and so everything that I do and everything I feel in the work is colored by that. If you cut me, I bleed public defender, so that's the guy that I am. Number two, if I weren't a lawyer, I would be a jazz musician. And I'm really not that good as being a jazz musician and only a slightly better lawyer, so that's why I'm here before you. Number three, I have three young sons. They're not so young anymore, 20, 16, and 14 on Saturday, and it does motivate me to think a little bit about criminal justice, criminalization, a little bit differently than I did before. I'm the executive director for the Center for Constitutional Rights, and it's CCR for short. For those of you who don't know, we've been around for 51 years. And we started out by litigating in the South, in Mississippi, rural Mississippi. And the thing that's going to come through my discussion about our work and the three issues that I want to present today is that one of the things that CCR does that most legal organizations do not is that we partner very deeply with social movements, with the people who are literally the most disenfranchised by the policies that we're seeking to undo. And that has a lot to do with both the type of cases that we take and why we do it. I also want to acknowledge that a good friend of mine and former CCR staff attorney, Professor Jose Marin, is here as well. It's wonderful to see you. And I was a summer intern in 1990-something back in the day, and Professor Marin was a staff attorney at CCR and really got my juices flowing about what justice might look like. So that's what's happening. I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about how black folks, brown folks, and Muslims have become criminalized, how these communities, not just individuals, these communities have become walking crime statistics, and what we can do about it. And I'm going to tell that story through three cases that CCR has done. Some of which you may have heard of, some of which you may not have. The first case I'm going to talk about is a case called Floyd versus the City of New York, which, as was mentioned, was the stop, question, and frisk case that we did here in New York City. The second case is a case called Hassan versus City of New York. It involves the same defendant, which is the New York City Police Department, but this involves spying on mosques in the state of New Jersey. And the third case I want to talk to you about is Endelon versus ICE, it's National Day Laborers Organizing Network versus ICE. And this was a Freedom of Information Act case that challenged and got more information about the Secure Communities program, which was rolled out by President Obama. So, is everybody ready? I don't think people are ready. Did everybody eat lunch? I actually didn't eat lunch, and so I have a confession to make before I started. I went into the back, and I actually swiped one of those cookies before the guy even took the wrapping off. So I'm wired up, and I'm ready to go. So the story of Floyd versus City of New York, most of you who have heard about the stop and frisk case might have heard about it starting in 2013, 4 years ago, when District Judge Shira Shindland issued this broad sweeping ruling in the district court that found the stop and frisk program unconstitutional on 2 grounds. On the Fourth Amendment grounds that the police officers were stopping and questioning people without reasonable suspicion, and on the 14th Amendment grounds, which is they were doing it predominantly to African American and Latino people. What you might not know is that the case didn't start, obviously, in 2013. It didn't even start in 2003. It actually started in 1999. And why am I taking you back to 1999? Because in 1999, a young African immigrant named Amadou Diallo was shot by the New York City Police Department. And he was someone who was an immigrant here in New York. He was living up in the Bronx. There was a unit in the police department called the Street Crimes Unit. And the Street Crimes Unit was a plainclothes unit, and they used to run around, and their jobs were to get drugs and guns, particularly off the street. It was a relatively new endeavor, being plainclothes, that they could move in ways that obviously uniforms couldn't. They knew the communities in ways that uniforms didn't. And so they gave them the opportunity to kind of get in there, figure out where the stuff is, and take it down. But here's the problem. The Street Crimes Unit had a horrible reputation for beating people, for taking money, for shooting people, for putting false evidence on folks, all without accountability. They weren't showing their badges. Of course, they were undercover, and there was no accountability. So in 1999, there was a call for a rape charge. There's a rape that's happened. It's come in. The Street Crimes Unit is on the street. They drive up Amadou Diallo's street. He's standing in the vestibule in front of his building. And when the police come, the guns drawn, the whole routine, you know what it's like, get on the ground, this, that, and the other thing. And he does the thing that made the most sense if you were an immigrant in this country, but made the worst, it was the worst mistake he ever made as an African man in New York City. He did the following thing. He reached into his wallet, into his back pocket, and pulled out his wallet. But before the wallet became visible, the Street Crimes Unit started shooting. Shot him 41 times. For the Bruce Springsteen fans in the building, there's a song called 41 Shots. You should check it out. It's about that shooting. So we got involved because community groups on the ground, and particularly the National Congress of Puerto Rican Rights, were saying that the Street Crimes Unit is one of the biggest challenges in the black community. They are unaccountable. They take our guys. They put false charges on people. Something needs to be done. So we filed a lawsuit actually against the New York City Police Department with the purpose of trying to disband the unaccountable Street Crimes Unit. So here's what happened. We were successful. We settled that case. I think it was 2002 and 2003. The Street Crime Unit was disbanded. The police department entered into a consent decree, which is a post-litigation agreement to make certain reforms. Amongst the reforms that they wanted to make, they had a 1-page anti-racial profiling policy. Done and done. In the monitoring period, after the settlement, we started to notice an interesting thing. So this is called justice nerds, right? So in order to be a justice nerd, you have to have some kind of crazy, unaccountable love for data. I know you all do. I know you all do. So here's what happened. In the Street Crimes Unit case that we first did, as part of that litigation, we had access to police stop data through the litigation, that the police department would give it to the lawyers. The lawyers could look at that information and categorize it and then use it to frame their case. We were not allowed to make that information public. So what we started to, through what's called a protective order, so it's something that happens in litigation. So what happened was, between the time that the case settled and probably 4 years later, we began to see, even though that there was an anti-racial profiling policy in place, that the stops that the police department were doing went up, and they went up dramatically. They went up a total of 600% when we got to 2011 to about 685 people. Why were the stops going up, even though they had settled the case to go down? The answer might surprise you. I wouldn't say that the answer is individual police bias. I wouldn't say that the answer is just bias of the police department. I wouldn't say that the answer is a rise in crime. I would say that it was none of those things. What it was federal money. Why is there federal money going into the police department? Because in between the time that we had filed the case and the time that we had settled the case, a thing called 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, there was a ton of federal money that was going to local law enforcement around the country to keep us safe from the terrorist threat. The New York City Police Department saw an opportunity, and the city saw an opportunity to use some of those funds to do street deterrence operations in every borough of New York City, completely and totally unrelated to terrorism. But it had to do with how the police, it was an opportunity for the police to be able to bump up their data and to be able to create these massive programs. And one of the programs that they created was the Stop and Frisk program. So by the time we get to 2013, when we won the case after a 9.5-week trial, and you all know this, the data that we had gotten from that earlier case, it continued. We also filed another motion for the judge to say, Judge, this is in the public interest. We need to make this data public. The judge agreed, and that's why you all know the stats that I'm going to tell you, that there were a total of 5 million stops that were made over a relatively short period of time between 2005 and 2012. Of the stops that were made, 87% of the stops were Black and Latino people. I'm going to say that again. 87% Black and Latino. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, there could be a number of reasons for that, and there could be a number of logical reasons for that. Maybe there's more crime in the Black neighborhood. Maybe Black people are more, and Latino people are more, commit more crimes. Maybe this is something that has to do with concentration in high crime neighborhoods. Maybe this has something to do with concentration in low income neighborhoods. So when we went through the data, we did a regression analysis on it. What we found was that the number one reason why people were being stopped was race, when you looked at all of the other factors. And here's the interesting thing. That Blacks and Latinos were stopped more, even if they were in predominantly Black or Latino neighborhoods, mixed neighborhoods, predominantly white neighborhoods. Black and Latino people were stopped more, whether they were in high-income neighborhoods, middle-income neighborhoods, or low-income neighborhoods. No matter how you sliced it, that program was stopping Black and Latino people more than white people. In addition to that, that's the 14th Amendment argument, right? And the Constitution says you can't treat one group of people differently than another. So then the question then is, well, are they really being treated differently? And if you look at the hit rate, if you look at for all of those 5 million stops, you might ask yourself, well, what percentage of those stops actually resulted in an arrest or a summons being issued? And the answer to that is 10%. 10%. If you were starting a business and you came to me and you were asking me for investing in your business and you said, I have this great business, it's fantastic, it's citywide, I've got a 10% success rate, I would not give you any money. I wouldn't want to have my tax dollars going to anything that the government does that has a 10% hit rate, and on top of that, or success rate, and on top of that, criminalizing millions of Black and brown people. And this relates to the Fourth Amendment argument, which is, well, if they're stopping so many people, and only 10 to 12% are issued a summons or are arrested, that means that roughly 88 to 90% of the people have done nothing wrong, or at least have done nothing wrong that would warrant the police stopping them. So then we started to look at what the reasons the police officers were stopping people were. And under Terry versus Ohio, which is the Fourth Amendment case that determines how the police can do street stops, particularly whether they can do a pat-down search and what are the circumstances by which police officers can stop you. The Supreme Court precedent in the Constitution requires something that's very minimal. You need to have a reasonable suspicion that someone has done something wrong, is doing something wrong, or is about to do something wrong, and it has to be an articulable suspicion. Now, these are big words, so let me sort of break that down. A reasonable suspicion means a suspicion for which you can give a reason. An articulable suspicion is a articulation of the reason that you stop the person. That is a very, very low standard. What we found, looking through the data, because there were these forms that were called UF-250s that every police officer is required to fill out when they do a police stop, we looked through millions of UF-250s. And the number one reason that the police officers listed as to why they were stopping people were because of what are called furtive movements. Y'all know what a furtive movement is? This is my impersonation of a furtive movement. Furtive means that we're kind of looking shady, basically. So a furtive movement might look something like this. Something along those lines. But the point is, 55% of all of these stops, that's the reason that the police gave. Now, reason will tell us that that's what's called a pretextual reason. They were not stopping people because 55% of the black and Latino population was walking around being furtive whenever they saw police officers, although there might be an argument for that. It's a pretextual reason. It was really about race. So we won that case in 2013, and now we're in an interesting reform period. And the reform period is where we are looking, we're doing some training with the New York City Police Department has done completely new training on what the constitutional principles are, how that begins to work. They're training in the academy starting now. There's a range of very good things that are happening. But I want to talk to you about body cameras, because body cameras is a very interesting thing that has come up in the litigation, and my position on it might surprise you. But before I get to body cameras, I want to talk about some other folks. I want to talk about Hassan versus City of New York. So we remember that I just took you through the arc from 1999 to 2013 in the stop and frisk case. The New York City Police Department during that period of time was also busy in the state of New Jersey. And you might ask yourself, how is it that the New York City Police Department is doing covert operations in the state of New Jersey? You might be asking yourself, right? That's a jurisdictional question. Last time I checked, I didn't think that was allowed to happen. Well, all things are possible in the post 9/11 period. And so the New York City Police Department actually had a very broad program where they saw the threat coming from the Muslim community. So they created a program where they had a program to spy on every mosque within a 250-mile radius of New Jersey, of New York. So if you take out your Google Maps and you do 250-mile radius, you'll realize that it's actually not just New York, that's also New Jersey and Connecticut. So the New York City Police Department was using informants and undercovers to go into mosques just to listen, to hear what was happening, spying on religious procedures that were happening in the Muslim community around the tri-state area. Why is this a problem? I want to take you back to the concept of profiling. And this is really when I'm talking about how three communities, black, Latino, Muslim, and undocumented people are criminalized, there's a certain way that that happens. And the first thing that has to happen is that the law enforcement, well, actually the government, the politicians need to create a threat narrative. They need to make people very afraid of those communities. And the way that that threat narrative has developed over hundreds of years in the United States with respect to African Americans is that every community that has a majority of African Americans has some element of criminality to it. That's the narrative that goes out. And it used to be that black people have a proclivity for crime. We're just more inclined to do illegal things than white folks. Now, in the public dialogue, people can't say that anymore, and it began to shift. And it began to shift to say, well, it's not every black person that's doing something wrong, but some black people in those communities are doing something wrong. So we need to use our law enforcement mechanisms to keep the people that aren't doing bad things safe from the people that are doing bad things. So you see how that shifts, right? It used to be, how do you keep the white community safe from the criminal black population? Now it's begun to shift. How do we keep the law-abiding black citizens safe from the non-law-abiding black citizens? And what that requires is deeper intervention. And here's the thing. If you are from a law enforcement perspective, how would you tell whether a black person is a law-abiding black person or not? Can you tell just by looking at people? You really can't. So in order for that to happen, you need some measure of intervention into the community, some level of law enforcement intervention, to be able to essentially not divine this, but to be deep into the community to try to separate the law-abiding people from the non-law-abiding people. And that is the problem that we have with racial justice in this country, particularly with respect to law enforcement, is that it is not enough to police communities in a way that keeps communities safe. It has to be, and the prevailing winds now, that we have to police communities in order to infiltrate them, in order to separate the bad people from the good people, even when there's no meaningful way to separate bad people from good people in that context. It's the same thing in the Muslim context. You can't tell if a person who is Arab, let me just sort of say this, not everybody knows this. Arabs, not all Muslims are Arabs. Not all Arabs are Muslims. So you can be Muslim and not Arab, you can be Muslim and Arab, you can be Muslim and not Arab, right? So we need to be real about that. And there are a whole range of different things. You can be black and Muslim, you can be black and not Muslim. So the point is that if you see an Arab person, or if you're with an Arab, in an Arab community, or a community where people appear to be Arabs, you can't tell who is a Muslim and who is not. There is no way to tell without further intervention. And that goes against the big narratives, because they say that when you listen to President Trump, even if you listen to previous administrations, they say that the threats are coming internally from these communities. So we need to infiltrate these types of communities. So we are now in a community infiltration paradigm with respect to law enforcement. And finally, I think with respect to undocumented people, it's the same thing. If you have somebody, if you're on the border, if you're in any city in the world, in the country, first of all, you cannot tell whether somebody is documented or not, regardless of what they look like, and particularly in this city. Number two, if you see somebody that is Latino, you can't tell whether the Latino person is undocumented or not. So you need some measure to be able to infiltrate, to be able to get a little bit more information from the person or from the community in order to make that assessment. So rather than having the Constitution be a bar for law enforcement being infiltrating and getting information that people should not have to give, what we're now seeing is that the Constitution in a lot of contexts becomes this antiquated obstacle for keeping us safe. That's how the paradigms had begun to shift, and that's how they've shifted in those three communities. So with respect to Hassan versus City of New York, we had a very interesting endeavor. So the New York City Police Department was spying on these mosques, as I mentioned to you. The New York City Police Department was not telling anybody that they were spying on these police departments. You know how they knew? They knew, how we knew? We found out because there are only really three ways that you ever find out what the government is doing when the government doesn't tell you. Way number one is that the people in the community tell you that this is happening. Most people don't listen to the people in the community. Reason number two is that the media tells you what's happening. And we know what the media is under attack right now. Reason number three is that it becomes patently observable, or there's information that somebody leaks about what's happening. It's the only ways that we know about these things. So most of society has no idea what's going on, and they just listen to the talking points. So here's what was happening. The Associated Press wrote a series of articles that won a Pulitzer Prize, and they wrote these articles about this New York City Police Department spying programs on mosques, and they blew the whole thing wide open. And it was because of that, CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, we partnered with a group called Muslim Advocates based in San Francisco, and we filed a lawsuit. It was primarily a First Amendment lawsuit that was essentially pushing back on the New York City Police Department for doing religious profiles on Muslim folks. A very interesting thing happened in that case. That case is still ongoing. The interesting thing is that we filed it in New Jersey, and the judge that issued the decision, the city said, well, the New York City Police Department said, here's the story. We are not religiously profiling anybody. What we are doing is that because of the 9/11 tax, this is actually in their briefing papers, it's 12 years later, because of the 9/11 tax, we know how dangerous it is to let communities, people that are in these communities that are doing bad things kind of flourish. So what we were actually doing is we were not infiltrating communities. What we're doing is we're building relationships with communities, that we're going into the communities and we're listening to what they have to say. We're not running in and arresting anybody, and it's actually not, and we're not doing it because they're Muslim. We're doing it because the threat happens in the Muslim community, right? This is the New York City Police Department saying. Now, if you switch that out and you say we're not being racist against black people in New York City. We're just doing this because crime happens in black communities. You know, we're back in that piece. That's the narrative that law enforcement, and particularly post 9/11, has been using. So when they moved to dismiss the case, the judge actually dismissed the case based on that motion, and the judge wrote a 10-page opinion. And just to give you a sense of what that is, the New York City stop and frisk case was 219 pages. This opinion was 10 pages. It's like the fortune cookie of legal opinions, right? It was just tiny. And if it's that small, that you know that it's not going to be very well reasoned. And what the judge said that there was no harm to the Muslim community, which is one of the elements. There was no harm to the religious Muslim community because they didn't know that they were being spied upon. And the only people that told them that we were being spied upon was the press. So if anybody caused the harm to the Muslim community, I swear to you, this is in the papers, it's the Associated Press and not the New York City Police Department. Dismiss the case. All right. What does a lawyer do when your case gets dismissed over some stuff like that? Well, you keep fighting, right? And so one of the things that we do at CCR is that we are very creative, and we're a political organization, and at some level. We think not just about what is the policy issue before us, but what's the arc of history that actually has led us to this point? What can we learn from battles that have been happening in the past? And so what we did was we reached out to the Korematsu family. Korematsu was a case that happened in 1944. I believe it was a Supreme Court case. It was a challenge to the Japanese internment camps. Right. The executive order for the Japanese internment camps, order number 9066, actually was issued 70 years ago this year. And this was the situation where we were at war with Japan. The U.S. government said, we can't trust any of the Japanese Americans, even people that were born here. We're going to round them up, put them in concentration camps, uproot them from their homes, take them away from their jobs, and put them in camps. That is what we did in this country. The Supreme Court said it was constitutional. 70 years later, everybody looks back on that and says, my God, how did we let that happen? But here we are again. 2016, 2017, we've got the New York City Police Department saying we are not discriminating because they're Muslim. We are doing this stuff because we're scared and keeping people safe. And it's exactly the same argument that the federal government made in Korematsu. So we partnered with Karen Korematsu, who's the daughter of Fred Korematsu, who was the main plaintiff, and a number of the folks that fought that legal battle, and they wrote this amazing amicus brief. It's a friend of the court's brief. So we appealed the case. We're arguing the case. They helped, along with other groups, to frame this in a historical narrative. This is not just about 9/11. This is not just about Muslim threat. This is about us and what we do in times of great fear. And an amazing thing happened. We got a fantastic ruling from the appeals court that put the case back on track. But the amazing thing wasn't just that we won, it's what the court said. And the court said in this fabulous opinion, and I think in large part because we took the historical piece, the court said, what is happening, what the New York City Police Department is doing to Muslim Americans is the same that happened with the communists in 1917. It's the same thing that happened with the Japanese Americans during World War II. It's the same thing that happened with the civil rights activists in the 1960s. And then the court said, when will we see with foresight what we can see so clearly in hindsight? It was an amazing opinion. And that opinion sort of carries us through to this day. So one of the pieces that I want to point out here, particularly to you, young folks that are going into the criminal justice field, is that data is deeply important. You can live or die by data. You have to be able to show and demonstrate what is actually happening, as opposed to the world which just has very unformulated opinions. You probably, as data people, go home for holiday break and sit around the table and Auntie so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so will say something. You'll be like, my God, you just can't say that because it's so much more complicated than that. And that's really important. But there's another piece that's important too, which is, this is called justice nerds. So that's the nerd part. But let me just talk about justice for a second. That part of the vision that we have to have in going into this work now is forward-looking vision and backward-looking vision. We have to see how we got to this point and what battles we fought to get to this point that are replicating themselves now before we move forward. And then we have to think through what are people going to say if we get up and make a press statement, or if we write a report next week? What are people going to say 50 years from now about what we're doing today? Are we going to be on the right side of history? Are we going to be the people that are moving towards justice? Or are we just going to be making it okay for a discriminatory machine to continue happening now? Those are the big questions that we're asking ourselves. So let me get to the immigration piece, but I wanted to say this one thing. 50 years ago was 1967. Can anybody tell me who the two major internal threats were to the United States according to the FBI in 1967? The activists, Malcolm X. A guy from Georgia. Oh, Martin Luther King? Yeah. Martin Luther King. Anybody else? Communists? Anti-war movement? The Black Panthers. Okay. Those are great things. So here's the answer to the question. The answer is that all of them were threats, according to J. Edgar Hoover, was the head of the FBI. But the two major threats, the threats around which the FBI built its surveillance program in the 1960s and 1970s, the efforts by which it destabilized social movements in the 60s and the 70s, it was not terrorism. It was the civil rights movement, and it was the Nation of Islam, which is Malcolm X and other folks. Why am I telling you this? Because looking back 50 years ago, we might be tempted to say, are you kidding me? The civil rights movement of the United States, which we now hold to be one of the most transformative moments in our history, was considered the biggest threat by the FBI that required them to surveil, to arrest, to collude, and to take it apart? Well, the answer is yes. And so that type of historical perspective is really important, because if we think about who the threats are now that the FBI is talking to us about, that the CIA is talking about, that this administration is talking about, we should take a step back. And because we put the nerd in the justice, we should be thinking more concretely, well, what does this crime trend look like? Are undocumented people really committing so many crimes that it's going to take up so much of our national space and dialogue? Are Muslim Americans really committing so many terrorist acts in the United States and abroad that it's going to, we're going to be spending millions and millions of dollars in this new budget to be able to contract it? African Americans and people living in cities, do we really want to start a national stop and frisk program? The answer, of course, to me, is no. Because the more that you know about how these things operate, the less you believe the narratives. Which brings me to the Secure Communities litigation. When President Obama was elected president, I cried like a baby. I literally never thought that I would see a black president in my lifetime. I'm just telling you. And one of the things that we do at CCR is we are an equal opportunity suer, so we do sue the pants off of pretty much every president and attorney general for terrible things like they did. We sued to close Guantanamo under George Bush. We sued Barack Obama about that as well. We sued Barack Obama for his drone program where he was killing U.S. citizens abroad without any type of judicial process. We sued him there. And we also sued under immigration, because it is true that President Obama was the deporter-in-chief. President Obama deported, and his administration deported, more people than any other administration in American history. And here's a story of how the Obama administration began to connect the dots with local law enforcement. There was a program that's called the Secure Communities Program. I'm going to take a pause here just to say that it's called the Secure Communities Program. And it might make you feel that it is a program designed to make communities feel secure, but it was actually a program that was designed to pull communities apart. And what it did was, I think there were roughly 1,300 local jurisdictions where local law enforcement, who are prohibited largely from performing immigration functions, this was a program by which the Obama administration tried to get state governors to agree to a program where there would be a joint connection with the data in the criminal justice context to be able to give that data to immigration and customs enforcement. Again, justice nerds, it's all about the data. And it's not just about how you count it, it's also how you keep it safe and where that data goes. And so what does that mean? So for some people who are thinking from a policy perspective, well, we've got a problem with undocumented folks, or too many people are here illegally. We have a problem with crime. Doesn't it make sense to be able to have that information shared so that you don't have two different entities, one federal and one local, working against each other while the bad people get away? That makes total sense. But look at it from not the policy perspective, look at it from the community perspective. Of the community perspective, what that means is that if you know that your information is being shared by local law enforcement to the federal immigration enforcement agency, are you more likely or less likely to report crimes or things that have happened to you if you feel that the information is going to be sent to Immigration and Customs Enforcement? In some communities, you are less likely to do it. So it has the exact opposite effect. It actually makes communities less safe because they won't avail themselves of local law enforcement to help them with local problems because they think they're going to end up getting swept up in a deportation situation. You know, not for nothing. We filed that back in 2008, 2009. We are in this boat right now with this administration, I'm just saying. So if you look at it from the community perspective, it doesn't work. Let's look at it from the racial profiling perspective. Remember when I was talking to you about how you can't tell whether somebody is undocumented just by looking at them and you need a little bit more information about it? So what would it look like if the Customs and Border Patrol, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that doesn't have a lot of information on who's undocumented in the community, they have some, gets massive amounts of information, and that they can go to the jails and question people. They can see where people pop up, where they're living, and they can go and get them. It actually it gives federal law enforcement the ability to do something that they were not able to do by virtue of the federal immigration law, basically to get into your business if you get connected to the criminal justice system. And I'm not just talking about people who get arrested for violent crimes. I'm talking about people who make reports to the police. I'm talking about people who call the police because they're in a domestic violence incident. The police now have your information. They have the information for you. They have the information for your family. They have the information for your abuser. So when you look at it either from the community perspective or the constitutional perspective, it's problematic. Let me give you an example of. So let me. I want to wrap this piece up and get to body cams. Why am I telling you the story about secure communities? Because secure communities is one of those situations that allows Immigration and Customs Enforcement to get into your business, although indirectly. And to be able to make more people deportable. And even if they're not deportable, it makes more people insecure and precarious. The number one rule that I've learned in my work doing social justice work, particularly on behalf of Black, brown, and poor people, the number one rule for poor people is any opportunity to not get your name in any government database is a good thing. Because once your name is in a government database, they basically own you. Particularly in Republican administrations. They own whether you're working or not, they own how you take care of your kids, they own what type of housing you get, they own it all. So the idea of keeping poor folks out of databases is a very good idea, but it does come into odds with, I think, with some of the questions that you guys are struggling with around questions about databases, because putting more people in databases can make a more effective crime-fighting tool. So the question that you have to ask yourself is, what is my purpose in this work? Is it about building a better crime-fighting machine, or is it about keeping communities safe? Because there's a narrative that says building better crime fighting keeps communities safe, but the stories that I'm telling you are ones in which more law enforcement makes communities less safe. Something for you guys to grapple with and to think about. I'm going to have to wrap up, and I want to just say this last thing about body cams, because I know y'all been waiting. When we won the stop and frisk case, we did not ask for police body cams. We did not. When Judge Shearer wrote this wonderful opinion, 219 pages, one of the first reforms she said, and I want to create a pilot program for police body cams. That put us in a very awkward position because body cams are not necessarily the way to, they're not going to do the thing that people say. And I'll tell you very quickly why. That I was very involved in the movement for Black Lives, working with the Black Lives Matter movement, and they say two things. They say, number one, there's an divest strategies that we should be doing in communities. If we're going to spend $1, it should be for the communities and not for the government entities that are supervising communities. And number two, they say that budgets are an expression of our values. So taking those two particular things, what we see about body cams is that we looked at the pilot, when you look at the pilot study that happened in California, the police, when they were talking about body cams, they say body cameras are great because what they will do is they will deter bad actors from doing things to us, and they will show that the majority of our interactions with them are actually peaceful. So it is a very good thing for us. A lot of folks in the Black community love body cameras, but they said the exact opposite thing. They said it will be great because it will deter bad police action, and it will show that the rest of us aren't doing anything wrong. So now you have many people in the Black community and the police department all wanting body cameras. It sounds like a great solution. The civil libertarians are like, well, here's the thing. Body cameras create data. Where's all that data going? How do we know what that data is going to be used for? The law enforcement people are like, data is good. We can build better crime-fighting situations. And so now we have, essentially, again, a fight over the data. And our view at CCR is that unless we are ensured that law enforcement is not going to use that data for law enforcement purposes beyond what was being filmed, it's a bad idea. Then going to the budget piece, most police departments are small. They can't afford body cameras, and when they get very excited about body cameras, what they do is they issue bonds. And what that means is that the taxpayers in that locality have to pay for these new body cameras. And when President Obama announced in the 21st Century Policing Commission that body cameras were the way to go, the stock for body cameras shot up. Two main companies that do body cameras, one of which you've heard of. You ever heard of the company Taser? Taser does body cameras. So think about this now. You are now in a community. The police say we want body cameras. The body cameras are going to cost millions of dollars. We are now going to raise your taxes so people in this community can pay Taser to make sure that the police don't kill us. Something to think about. Something to think about. I want to leave time for questions. Many more things that I would love to talk with you about. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. If anybody has questions, you can just come up to the microphone and ask. I think maybe I could start. I was struck when you mentioned the FBI going after civil rights organizations in the 60s. And it made me think about, the contemporary FBI and James Comey. I wonder if you have an opinion as to how much or whether the FBI has improved at all since the 60s in the terms of their targeting.
The FBI, yeah, I do have an opinion. The FBI has shifted. What I tend to do is I tend to look at law enforcement from a very narrow perspective. I look at where the tip of law enforcement touches the communities. That's not all of law enforcement, that's not all of the community, but that's where I live. And so what I've seen is that the FBI policies of surveillance and destabilization, which they were doing to social movements in the 60s, has shifted very much now to doing that to Muslim communities here. Another case that we did very quickly, we did a case called the no-fly case. There's a rule that says the federal aviation officials are allowed to keep you off a plane. They can mark you as someone who cannot fly if they feel like you're a danger. Right? But you have to be a dangerous person in order to do that. So some people, I don't think it's right, but there's some people that do it. The FBI, we filed a case where the FBI had wanted to turn 4 people into informants in their own communities, which they refused to do. And the FBI threatened them with putting them on the no-fly list if they didn't inform on their communities. And that is old school FBI tactics. What does that mean for the people? That means that they can't go and see their families. They can't do anything unless they agree to spy on the communities. So that's the kind of coercion that is happening where the FBI is meeting a lot of Muslim communities today.
Hi. So I just...
Tell me your name.
Oh, my name's Sebastian. I'm a
Hi,
PhD
Sebastian.
student here. So I just had a few questions, but I'll just go with this one. Today it was recently announced that the Department for Homeland Security launched Voice, the Victims of Immigrant Crime Engagement. program. What are your thoughts on that, and how will it impact undocumented communities? Because the data says that particularly undocumented immigrants are less likely to be engaged in crime, but with the proposal of voice, it's going to show an image. It might show an image that undocumented immigrants are more engaged in crime. So yeah, that's one of the questions.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's a great question. I want to answer it this way: that this administration is going to be a disaster for undocumented communities and for smart law enforcement solutions. I predict that although I think the unions are very much behind Donald Trump, and there's a lot of money that's flowing to law enforcement, and I know law enforcement like that, I predict that there's going to come a point where the effect on the communities and the effect of the law enforcement to be able to do things in a smart way that makes sense will come together, and people will be pushing back on that. And the reason why I say that is it's not the voice question. I think that voice is an age-old victims' rights tactic that shifts people's attention from what the data says to how victims are surviving, and it's an old tactic, but I think it's one that's likely to work. But if you look beyond that, and if you look at the law enforcement. The executive orders that have come down. There was one that had to do with criminal justice. There were three of them, and one of them it authorized Attorney General Jeff Sessions, which is a whole nother lecture, or a round of drinks if y'all want to buy me one. That authorized Jeff Sessions to pass new legislation to look at rising crime. The name of this executive order, which you will all love, in most places people give me blank stares, but you will appreciate this. The name of the executive order was, this is an executive order to reduce rising crime and restore public order. And the reason why some of you were chuckling is because you might have sworn that you have been reading recently that the crime rate actually isn't rising, and that it's been decreasing overall nationally, and there are spikes and different things like that. But we have an executive order that the job of Jeff Sessions is to reduce rising crime, which doesn't exist, restore public safety, which hasn't been taken away. So to get to the meat of this, in that executive order, there are three particular crime trends that Jeff Sessions is supposed to look at. One is international narco trafficking. It's legit. Number two is violent crime. It's always good when people look at violent crime. And number three, and I'm quoting from the executive order, illegal immigration. And it didn't say crimes committed by undocumented people. It said illegal immigration, and this is actually the first time, and it might be a hastily written executive order because they're known for that, might be the first time that the fact of being undocumented makes you a crime statistic. And that's part of in the discussion that I'm having here is what the big challenge is. There's a framing that people then begin to move into, and it's going to be very, very dangerous and terrible for undocumented people. I think there are probably other questions. I know you all have questions. You have a question? You don't have a question? Let's let somebody else go first. I can feel it. It's coming. Nobody has any questions about what I just said? Sebastian's got it. Thank you. Thank you. See, now the floodgates are going to open and we're going to run out of time, and y'all going to be like, I wish I'd asked you that question before.
Okay.
What's your name, sir?
My name is Brian
Hi,
Person. I go to Government Community College, but I'm trying to attend John Jay.
Great.
Okay, so when you talked about the 1999 case, I had a connection to the Khalif Browder case.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, do you think there will be changes a decade or two, or you think this is going to keep going on forever? Because, yeah, that's my question.
That's a great question. I think there are always changes. Always changes. And so the mistake that most people, I'll put it this way, that people that do the policy work, like we do, and like you will be doing, we see the changes that are made all the time, and there's 2 steps forwards and 1 steps back. People that don't pay attention don't see the changes, but the question really is whether people feel those changes in the community. That to me is the measure, and it's the effect. And I think that, even if you think about the stop and frisk lawsuit. Now, this lawsuit didn't end unconstitutional stop and frisk everywhere in America, and it did shift the policies, but people had been reporting for a while that they were not getting harassed as much by the police as they had been prior to the lawsuit. And so that is a change that definitely happened, but these things do happen cyclically. It depends on who's in charge. Somebody can come in like Barack Obama and say, we're going to switch things up. Somebody can come in like Donald Trump and say, we're going to send it back to the Stone Age. So these things happen cyclically. The most important thing is that people continue to fight and push it forward. You can't stand back and be you can't look at the trend and decide whether you want to get in. You got to be in when it goes up, and you got to be in when it goes down to be able to push it back. Well, thanks for that question, Brian. Sebastian, I think you're up. Is this the last? This is the last one. Okay.
Okay.
Don't y'all? Nobody come up to me after this and say, "I had a question, but I didn't want to ask." No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
So it's interesting that we discuss social movements, particularly those of the civil rights, like the civil rights movement, and how they were considered a massive threat by the federal government. Black Lives Matter, which is a wonderful movement. The NYPD has recently been accused or has been found to have been spying on activists from Black Lives Matter. And that's that seems to me like a clear violation of the Hanshu decree. So what are recourses for these activists? Because I'm like with a lot of them, so I was just curious.
Okay. Hanshu decree is a case that has been going on since well before you were born that governs police surveillance activity of activists. Been going on forever. And in fact, the New York City police Muslim spying case, there's one in New York, we're doing the one in New Jersey. The New York City police has been sent to the same judge that's handling the Hanshu case. And the question is, what can people do? There are a number of different things. I think number one, if folks file a lawsuit, it would likely get connected to the Hanshu decree and be dealt with that way. Number two, my organization has filed a Freedom of Information Act request with Color of Change about national spying policy on Black Lives Matter activists. So there are lawsuits that are going to be happening. The big challenge is that the Department of Justice has shifted. So on the national level, whereas you would have an Obama administration that might take a different approach to local and federal law enforcement, you're going to have a Trump administration that's going to take a hostile approach. But I think the answer is a lot more lawsuits are probably going to be filed and going through the courts for a couple of years. All right. Anyway, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.